Okay, today's going to be a pretty fun one. I've wanted to talk about this topic for absolutely ages, and we have finally got an amazing excuse, and that is Helldivers 2. So, Forbes published an article, and it was with this headline, quote, "After initial success, Helldivers 2 has lost 90% of its players with no signs of recovery." Quite the headline. This generated a lot of buzz. Yep, some people looking at this and saying, of course, PSN stuff, that was bad, players didn't like that, or having problems with the game. As an example, balance, variety. And then there's another side saying, hang on a second, that's not really accurate. That doesn't really capture the essence of what is going on, and this is an unproductive way to talk about games. I think the truth does lie somewhere in the middle. Now let's just check that headline for truthiness, okay? So, initial success, that's absolutely true. It was a massive success. Lost 90% of its players. Is that true? So, it is true that its concurrency has dropped to 90% of its prior peak. Now, concurrency is, of course, a measure of how many people are playing a game at the exact same time. So concurrency matters. It's what the article is talking about, but it is not what the headline said. The headline said 90% of players, and then we get to the problem. What the hell is a player? What is the cutoff to make you a player or not a player? Is it playing 6 times a week for many hours, or is it playing twice a week for just a few hours? That's the thing. Like, you play games. That's probably why you're here in this channel. I play games. It's why I'm doing this channel. So how much do you have to play a game for you to consider yourself a player of that game? Again, if you played Helldivers 2 30 hours a week when it was hot and fresh, we'd all say, like, yeah, you're a player. If I was playing that way, I'd say I'm a player of the game. But if I was only playing the game twice a week, I would still identify myself as a player of that game, because it's something that I do. So in both of those instances, hyper gaming and just playing it casually with your friends, are you a player of the game? Yes, you are. But the impact on concurrency is completely different. And the reason why that headline ended up being so emotive, even though it is just saying a number was this at launch and now it is this, is because when you read that headline, you see the word player. And player is a word that we sort of experience as a self-identifier. So the idea that people who play Helldivers 2, 90% of them are gone. That is not really accurate. That is not what concurrency is. It is, though, how we process that language, and that makes it a very emotionally compelling headline, because I think we all know if the headline read, "After initial success, Helldivers 2 concurrency has dropped 90% with no signs of recovery." That would hit hard, but it probably wouldn't hit as hard on the emotional level. Now, this is not me taking a dig at Forbes. I saw a bit of a drama around this with the writer, people trying to call him out, and I basically thought, this is interesting, Helldivers is interesting, and my job here is to cut through noise and to work out what's actually happening. So we see a day one peak of 64k. That soars to 459k as their network infrastructure grew to handle the success of the title. So that's the heights of these numbers. Let's talk about the new numbers, what's going on in, say, the last 2 weeks, where the peak concurrency is 59k, that's rounding up slightly. Now, from the last week, it's 45k, and the decrease from 459k to 45k did indeed get us the 90% reduction headline. Now, obviously, when a game is brand new, what does that mean? It means there's so much for you to do, so much to grind, so much to see. It's a time of wonder, so you put in massive gaming sessions, right? You might be sitting there playing Helldivers 2 with the boys, having 6-hour game sessions, and it's amazing. And I bring that up to say that provided servers can handle it, play session length has a massive impact on concurrency, and an extreme example of that happens with New World. Its 914,000 concurrent player peak was down to massive session times, because remember, if you're in the login queue for a game, but the exe is open, that counts as a game session because you're playing the game. You know, you're just looking at a loading screen. So with New World, that actually means that its concurrency numbers were somewhat artificially inflated because so many people were just looking at the login screen for 10 hours trying to get into the game. And then because the queues were basically hell, when they did get into the game, they didn't want to log off. That inflated session time, and that means that concurrency was massive. Now, when we look at dramas, the obvious one is PSN. The PSN account linking situation was a pretty massive story because people cared. It's the sort of thing where you could get that all fixed up in like 45 seconds. I don't really think it was people saying, oh, this 45 seconds, you know, I refuse to do it. It's too much of a hassle. No. I think it's principle. People don't like the idea of having to have a PlayStation Network account when they're playing a PC game on Steam. For so many people, it's not the 45, 60 seconds of friction. It is the principle of it, and I suppose also levels of trust with Sony regarding cybersecurity. So, when we look at the stats, do we see PSN leading to a massive drop in concurrent players, or was that just happening anyway? The good news is, here is some data. And I think what's the most interesting is when we take a look at the percentage gains. Of course, the percentage gains are mostly negative because they are in fact contractions. So from February to March is strong. We actually see a 4% contraction in peak players, but a 4.3% increase in average players. So that's real strong. But then from March to April, we drop concurrence by 21.6%. We drop average by 34.2%. And that does make sense to me. You see, April 7th spiked to 345k players. That was a spike that of course masks the waning concurrency, and the waning concurrency is better reflected in the average player numbers because averages are less prone to being, impacted by smaller spikes. From April to May, we see a giant decrease though, 63.5% going down to a 126,000 player peak, with the averages declining 54.4%. Of course, the PSN event happened at the start of May, so that might of course look causal. Now, I will still say, having a 126k peak is amazing, absolutely amazing, especially thinking about the size of Arrowhead as compared to many peers. Now, I have no doubt that the PSN thing contributed, but we can take a look at the angle of the line. So if you look at the angle of the line, what you actually see is it was decreasing faster before PSN happened. Now, that's not me trying to gaslight you and say that PSN was not a big issue. I'm absolutely not saying that. What I am saying is that it was not the start of a new trend. It happened in the middle of a trend that was already happening. I'll also say a trend that for the majority of games is completely normal and typical. As we move from May to June, we see the decrease continue, 27.1% loss in peak, 36.2% loss in average. Again, I don't think this is a reaction to PSN. I think PSN will, of course, be a contributor though, and people in certain regions not being able to purchase the game, that will probably impact some of their new player pickup. And of course, new players often should be a bulwark to any things that, that are declining. You see, when we're, say, dealing with software as a service, because realistically, this kind of is games as a service. So whenever you're doing software as a service or, a lot of like analytics for big companies, one of the things that people do is they look at customer cohorts. So they look at a customer cohort and they see how well does that cohort in particular retain. So what we're very much seeing with Helldivers 2 is it had a massive initial cohort of players. And it could just be that the game was so goddamn appealing that it had a remarkable ability to pretty much reach out to most of the people who would probably be interested. You could perhaps argue that if this was a game that wasn't really being backed by Sony, if it was maybe a little bit smaller and had a smaller release, maybe those concurrent numbers would actually look a bit different. Probably you'd have numbers that would nowhere near, be as high, but maybe those numbers would slowly increase, or we just wouldn't be seeing large decreases because word of mouth would grow the game as it's spreading. In this case, a lot of that word of mouth happened almost instantly, especially because the game was so well poised to just engage people, the battle for the creek and all of that stuff. Now, if we take a look at June, we see the averages are about 35k, and those increase to way over 70k by mid-month, and that 70k is impactful. And it's because of content, specifically a new jungle planet with a themed warbond. And I've got to say, the jungle planet is neat. You think about like Predator, and you can see people being excited about that. Now, that's a pretty major thing for us to think about. A planet arrives, it leads to a spike in players. That's extremely obvious, and I think it does show that novelty is what will drive people to return to the game, or at least to return to the game and bring in higher session times, with those session times then of course leading to better concurrency numbers. I do believe that if we were to look at this in terms of DAU, daily active users, weekly active users, and monthly active users, then while we would definitely see a decrease, I do not think it would be as stark, because the particular numbers that are publicly available for analysis are very contingent on session time. Now we can then take a look at Twitch, and with Twitch, like, look, the numbers absolutely do plummet from 150k initially to recently like about 7.5k average. I mean, I looked at it yesterday, there was like 900 people viewing the game on Twitch, but I really don't take too much stock in that, and one of the reasons is that Twitch is extremely personality driven, right? So what happens is loads of big streamers with big audiences hop onto a game when it's new and hot, they put in a lot of time, that makes the Twitch numbers massive. There will always be a decrease from that point. The challenge is that we usually compare games like this to incumbents. Now, those incumbents, well, we're talking about them because basically they are the ones who survived. So again, we need to think about things like survivorship bias. So many games come out and they do actually get plenty of people playing them in Twitch because some streamers go and check them out. But to actually have a long-term sort of dedicated game-only audience, that is vanishingly rare. So let's kick this over from saying numbers to trying to analyze those numbers. First thing, large drop-offs in games are completely standard. It is very rare to see games increase over time. Most live service games do not, and our industry is, as I said, dominated by incumbents. You can, as an example, point to Apex Legends. Its Steam numbers are always high, and sure, they've waxed and waned over time, but still, it's like often over 150, 200k. That is very, very strong. And similar goes for a lot of other titles. Take Fortnite, take Naraka Blade Point. That's a game that produces strong numbers and just seems to go under the radar. Take even PUBG, still there putting out amazing numbers. And of course you got your League, your Dota, Counter-Strike, all that stuff. Again, as I say, incumbents. And remember there was a report a while ago, it was either Twitch or Steam, but the rub basically was most people, most buzz is around old games. So many that are like 7 years, 8 years, 9 years old. And again, that speaks to the power of incumbency. Those are the games that we're able to get in there, capture players, and then create a very, very, very long and sticky habit. Now, the other factor here for me is PvE live services with that scale are vanishingly rare, right? If you go to Steam, you do see First Ascendant, but that just launched. Warframe, of course, a lot of PvE grinding. That, that does produce numbers. Of course, the ARPG audience are overdoing their thing. But going through Steam right now, you need to go down to Destiny 2, which is ranked 17. And again, it's an incumbent game. There are loads of single-player games that are pulling in more than Helldivers 2. Palworld, which just had content, Stardew Valley, Baldur's Gate 3. But again, those are all just complete outliers. Again, survivorship bias. And on the topic of Palworld, it's another notable one because it had massive drops in concurrency that again drew headlines, and those headlines drew a lot of criticism. And it wasn't a surprise because you cannot sustain 2 million concurrent players. Now its numbers at one point fell to below 30k. You might think, oh my god, Palworld, flash in the pan, dead. But that's just not really fair. Most people played it when it was new. They played it, they had their fill, maybe they'll come back later when there's content. Content has came, and their numbers have actually really soared up from where they were previously. Now, 150k isn't 2 million, but I think we all know that getting anywhere near 2 million is essentially impossible for a DLC to do. The job of the DLC is to basically say, hey, there's more stuff in Palworld for whenever you may choose to come back to it. So really, this doesn't seem as alarming when we try to step back a little bit. Now, there are other factors with Helldivers too. War bonds have been mixed. There have been notable, balancing problems, okay? Notable balancing problems, other factors have came in, and also there's the fact that the novelty of the Forever War will wear off, right? So people think about the great battle for the Creek, the campaign initially to push the automatons out of the, out of the solar, or out of the galaxy, whatever. Of course, what happened? Well, the automatons had to come back. It's not like you're just going to get rid of them forever. And I think people then just kind of noticed, well, yeah, this is a forever war. In a way, our victory will never be permanent. And to some people, that will take away from the narrative. That being said, I would say that the idea that it is a forever war, that is, I think, very much narratively resonant with the point of Helldivers. Anyway, when we take a look at those June numbers, we see a nice little spike with our jungle world, but it didn't have a large sustained impact. Of course, it wouldn't have had a large sustained impact because it's just adding a little bit more. It's not exactly doing the most transformational stuff, but the game long-term will benefit from another biome being there. So let's try to get some lessons out of this. Number one, most PvE games do not have as long of a tail. Destiny 2 is a bit of an outlier. Many games have tried to copy Destiny 2. Many of them have failed. Most of the big live services are rooted in PvP gameplay, and that makes a lot of sense because match-to-match variety is massive. That's one of the reasons why people just found they could keep on playing PUBG essentially forever, because they felt that there were so many possibilities and unique little player-driven stories that could happen within each match. Now, Helldivers 2 does a really good job of that in the context of PvE. But at the end of the day, they can only do so much with what they've got, and the variety is not going to be able to keep up with a lot of the variety and experience that keeps those PvP games feeling fresher for longer. And that's not really a knock on the developers, that is just an inherent challenge that they're going to have to overcome. So let's talk about the future. They have, in my view, two massive guns they can shoot. The first one is the third faction. Of course, Helldivers 1 had 3 opposing factions, so whenever they add them, that's going to be truly massive. That will change the context of every stratagem and every gun in the game. Things that maybe you had in your arsenal that you didn't use may suddenly become useful. That will drive novelty, and that will be strong. Next, Super Earth. Whenever they decide to actually take the fight to Earth, you know that is something that could be an expansion-sized event that can get people back. And the thing is, I'd say it's pretty obvious that the team involved are aware and that they're thinking of the long term. The first sign of that is their CEO stepping down from the CEO role specifically so he can actually work in the game side of things more. That's really important, and that shows what he's thinking about, because he's realized that his CEO duties are one thing, but they're getting in the way of just really pushing forward the game. And he's seeing that that is the important thing where he can probably move the needle most for his company. The next thing they've done is they have slowed down their updates. The war bonds are not monthly anymore. And I think that does show that the prior model had its strengths and its weaknesses. Obviously, the biggest strength is you would get, the Super Earth credits when you were playing matches. And that would mean if you play for maybe, as an example for one person in our team, 50 hours, he was able to buy a premium war bond, and he's nearly got enough currency to buy another premium war bond. That's really good. That actually feels pretty damn fair. And it really did drive a lot of player goodwill. I think that goodwill by and large still is there. PSN dented things, but PSN I think is something that people are mostly blaming Sony on because it was very much mandated by Sony. Now, we also know from what Johan had been saying, of course, the ex-CEO, that they internally had been full pelt working, right, since the game came out. Obviously, it came out in a way that was chaotic, right? They had to scramble to get the technology working, and then they were just trying to keep the game going with content, trying to run the war, and that ended up taking a little bit of a toll on the team, because you can't sprint forever. So them slowing down, I think, is a good thing. And that's because those decreases were happening before PSN. So if we're to try and break that down, we can think it could be driven by balance issues, it could be driven by not all of the war bonds being super engaging to people, and of course driven by people naturally playing a lot of a game when it's exciting and just playing it less when, it's not new and exciting. I mean, personally, I'd say that I imagine designing monthly war bonds is a humongous challenge, because you're going to blow through your good ideas really quickly, right? If you're just doing war bonds with weapons every single month. And you're also just going to lead to there being so many different guns in the game, and that'll make balance harder. And what's real notable here is they announced the slowdown in late May, right? That is obviously after PSN happened. I have got to imagine that they announced that because they saw that whatever they were doing was not ideal, and they decided they needed to maybe change things up. Either they want to do something new, or perhaps they just want to focus more on the war bonds being exciting, likely with the hope that those war bonds, when they come out, will actually drive players up. We saw a little bit of that with the Jungle Planet, but of course not the most sticking power. Now, as you draw this to a close and try to work out what's really going on, I do want to bring up one of the more recent major orders. It's pretty notable here. One thing I'll say, a game is always going to decrease. It is a question of what healthy, sustained population does it decrease to. And from that baseline, whenever future content and systems are added, does the baseline notch up and up and up and up? If it does, we have a good, sustainable, long-term live service game, which is what we want. Now, this new major order, it's a fairly interesting one. Essentially, it's an advanced weapon lab that was making an interplanetary battle station. Some some sort of ship that is far bigger than the player one that is interplanetary, which of course means that it travels, and that's got a lot of people thinking. Now, the current mission is to slow the bot assault so that plans for the battle station can be recovered from the lab. Where this is going could be kind of major. A lot of community discussion thinks in-game guilds could be something, maybe in a guild battle station, maybe some new stratagems. That really could move the needle. One of the things that sustained Helldivers' launch was it having, I think, a real strong network effect. The more people play it, then kind of like the more valuable it is as a game. If you add guild functionality into that, that's good, because it means your players will be more sticky, and it can then open up new design spaces. As an example, guild stratagems. What would those be like? Maybe upgrades to the guild battle station. All of that. You can see there a lot of potential for new types of content and even just for new types of progression, because by this stage, most people are kind of leveled up. They've got the stratagems that they need. In a way, the game systems are no longer saying, hey, there's like a very clear reason for you to keep on playing. Now, PC Gamer did helpfully point out that because of the time of year and, them being a Swedish company, basically the way they kind of do things is basically their holidays are quite clustered around the current period, as we essentially do July and August, so they will have a little bit of a diminished capacity. Now, I can see how immediately a lot of people would say, really? 90% decrease in concurrency and people are having a holiday? The thing is, it's about the long run, and it's a marathon, right? It's a marathon, not a sprint. If you burn your people out, you end up with a big problem. And as we've seen from the steepness of some of those decreases, the periods where they were all hands on deck trying to just put as much as they could into it, that those were not necessarily paying off. Certainly not to the degree where it would have justified, I suppose, the focus on the short-term management of the situation internally. They probably realized the big picture is the thing that matters. So to end this video, concurrency does not capture what a player is. Player is an identity. Is it a daily active user, a weekly active user, a monthly active user? There's games I might only play once or twice a month. I would still count myself to be a player of those games, and that's important for the companies who make those games, because if they have new content, guess what? I will return. And that probably means I'll pay some form of money. So whether I've been contributing to massive concurrency or not, the thing that matters is their game is still in my head. I still identify myself as liking that game. The truth is that millions of people had an amazing time playing this game, but it is a PvE game where many people were driven by grinding up unlockables and progression for their ship. I'm just going to end with a quote from our own, one of our own Helldivers to players in the office. But at the end of the day, for an entertaining co-op experience that's kept us coming back regularly 50, 100 hours in, not feeling the need to continuously grind to keep playing is no bad thing. And when people have been talking about, say, Final Fantasy XIV and Yoshi P saying, we're okay with you coming playing our patch, and when you've done, leaving. We just want you to come back for the next patch. And I think that is the major lesson in all of this. I've wanted to talk about this whole, player counts, the sky's falling down, big headlines. I've wanted to talk about this for a while, maybe help to add a little bit of clarity to the discussion, because it's very, look, if you see X amount of players are gone, you might actually think, oh my god, that game must be really on the down. But of course, it's only concurrency, session times matter, and recency of new content matters. I do not think it is full alarm bells, but I also think that this is something that Arrowhead should take seriously. Because while concurrency is not a perfect measure of their long-term health, far from it, it is still a relevant measure and a number that they want to increase. The question now is, can they stabilize that number, increase it, and to do so in a sustainable manner so that Helldivers 2 can be a part of the upper echelon of gaming for a good long time to come? Let me know what your thoughts and experiences are. With that said, thanks for watching. I'll see you back here on Monday.